Let me ask you a question. What age would you give the diagnosis of ADHD? 6 years old? 60 years old? 600 years old? How long has it been around? How long have we been using this diagnosis? And how much of that history is influencing the way that we see it today? My name is Martin Debane. I'm a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Geneva. I'm also a psychotherapist, and I'm interested in the emotional processes as well as the intentional processes, how these interact in adolescents and adults that have the diagnosis of ADHD. So in this session, we're going to talk about the history of the diagnosis, see how and to what extent it is actually influencing the way that we are constructing the idea of ADHD in our clinical practice. Let's start with a date, 1968. This is the first time that we see a diagnosis that is devoted to attentional disorders, especially in childhood, and it appears in the International Classification of Psychiatric Disorders from the American side, that is the DSM. Okay. Previously to 68, we have historical descriptions of individuals who indeed may show a syndrome of attentional problems, that is, a cluster of signs and symptoms that go together in an individual and that we can see actually across different individuals. So the first person typically that we historically cite is Sir Alexander Crichton in 1798. Who for the first time described psychopathology that was specifically targeted to attentional mechanisms. And this has influenced a number of authors that came after him. Medically speaking, we can say that the first publication on case descriptions of ADHD may indeed come from Sir George Frederick Still in 1902, who published a famous series of 20 cases in which he described individuals that had a kind of faulty moral control. What did he mean by that? He meant that there was a kind of deficit in the inhibition of actions that go against the better good of the group or of other individuals. Further along the 20th century, we can also underline the contributions of German authors Franz Kramer and Hans Pollnow, who described hyperkinetic behaviors in infancy and childhood. These descriptions, of course, have influenced greatly the notion of hyperactivity. Further along with the 40s and the work on medication, psychostimulants, as well as the 50s and the work on minimal brain damage and all the debates about minimal brain damage, actually, we see a first version in 1952 of the DSM, that international classification coming from the United States, where actually there is no precise description of attentional disorders, and we see it coming now further along in 1968 with the term hyperkinetic childhood reaction. Now, the last point of development of this diagnosis, or the one actually that is most resembles the current expression of ADHD, is the evolution from 1968 to 1980, that is version number 2 of the DSM and then version number 3 of the DSM in 1980, where we see ADHD, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, from the 1980s onwards, what is the kind of scientific development that we can notice? A useful publication is Samuel Cortese's and colleagues' current publication, 2022, where they actually describe the number of publications that are devoted to ADHD from 1990 to 2020. So from 1990 to 1997, we see an annual average of 10 scientific articles devoted to ADHD go up to 147 articles yearly. And then if we take 1999 to 2020, we actually see that we go from 264 articles per year to 2,067. So the progression is exponential and actually is comparable to the scientific attention devoted to childhood depression as well as childhood asthma. So to conclude, the diagnosis of ADHD, or at least its description, has been around for only 200 years. It started off describing children with attentional difficulties, but also then with behavioral, such as hyperkinetic or hyperactive behavioral difficulties. It's been spread to other age groups, such as adolescents and adults, and scientific attention has grown ever since the 1980s and 90s. However, we still see some of the influence of the socio-historical context in which the first descriptions were offered to the public. For example, a deficit in moral control, agitated children that were not careful with others is typically some of the stereotypes that we have still today and that we are fighting in terms of the stigma associated to ADHD. But as we'll see during this MOOC, ADHD is much more associated to specific challenges that need to be evaluated and that need to be identified for them to develop in a healthy way. And that's what we will see along this MOOC.